Welcome to Between Now and Next. This is a podcast series that's exploring that threshold between periods of collapse and renewal. And specifically, it's exploring this period of in between from a spiritual and consciousness perspective. I'm Annie Browning, and I'm so grateful that you are joining me today for this really important conversation. As we explore between now and next, we'll be looking at the spaces in between collapse and renewal. And specifically, we're going to explore how trust has eroded. Trust perhaps in your own relationships and in the larger societal structures that we're all part of right now. And specifically in this episode, we're going to look together at lived experience, research insights, some timeless ancient wisdom, and practical strategies that can help us understand this fracture and take a step forward in restoration and transformation. I want to start with sharing a personal story about trust, and one that likely you can relate to. So you are probably like me, perhaps, in which you were raised in a more conservative religious system than the one that you connect with right now. And for me, in that more religious conservative system, I was always instructed that if you were gendered as a female, that your position was subservient, especially to men. And this all perhaps patterned or worked with my ideology until around the age of 12. In which I began to sense or feel or know that I was being called into spiritual work. And so at that point in time, I went to my pastor and I expressed this wholehearted desire to follow a more spiritual path. And what I recall was perhaps the beginning stages of that erosion of trust, because he went and conversed with others who were elders in the community and came back and let me know that the best course of action that I could take would be to marry a pastor, to become a pastor's wife. Well, this didn't happen, and I followed a very different path that led me down the spirituality and consciousness pathway. And yet, what I'm referring to is that sense of disillusionment that begins. That feeling as though what's happening behind closed doors is where the true story is. And what's being presented on the surface for me, at that time was around, what the Bible said and around authority and around tradition, but that wasn't the whole story, that there was something more behind the scenes, really around power and structure and authority that was actually influencing the response that I got back. And sure enough, it didn't take long for my own perception of faith to begin to dismantle rather quickly. From that point on, I began to follow more of a mystical meditative path that led me into a very different direction. And yet it was just that one moment of disillusionment that began to crack and really shake the foundation of trust that I had for religious systems. You may pause right now and think of your own experience, your own perhaps parallel moment in time in which trust really started to shake and break down for you. So let's pivot together and talk a little bit about the actual research or science behind trust that can somehow explain for us and begin to demystify how we got here into this point of collapse and this globalized disillusionment with broader systems. So trust, it forms and it breaks, and it very much affects not just our personal well-being, but our collective whole, how we understand and relate to one another in terms of systems and being part of a collective. So trust is not just a feeling. It's not something that comes and goes and that ebbs and flows with our emotional state. It's actually a neurobiological necessity. And there's great research published in the Harvard Business Review that demonstrates that compared to people who work in low trust environments, those who work in high trust environments report 74% less stress, 106% more energy, and 50% higher productivity. And many of you have heard similar research before that high trust not only creates efficiency, productivity, and verifiable outcomes, but in general, we just work better when we're in high trust circumstances. And when we have moments where trust begins to break and fall apart, we can have the exact opposite experience. There was a comprehensive meta-analysis conducted in the field of psychology that shows betrayal actually starts to activate our brain's pain centers, similar to a physical injury. And so when we experience an institutional betrayal, much like we're experiencing right now, whether it's in terms of the systems that we know and trust in our culture, it's when we find that organizational trust plummeting, perhaps where there's a prioritization of other sorts of objectives or values that are exactly oppositional to what we value as being most near and dear, especially around needs like safety or security, then our stress hormone spikes as our sense of safety plummets. And perhaps most concerning is more recent recent research coming out of the Edelman Trust Barometer that reveals that a striking 55% of individuals on a global scale believe our political and economic systems are failing them, with trust in historic systems at a low across about 28 countries. And this erosion in societal trust is very much at the heart of what is happening right now as we perceive a collapse between where we have been now and where we are going as a group. And it is not surprising that we are experiencing a spike in anxiety and depression and also social polarization. So now let's go back and really draw on our wisdom traditions, our spiritual heritages that can provide wisdom for us to navigate these really challenging times between what is now and what is next, that in-between threshold moment. So I invite you to hear the Hasidic tale of a broken vessel and to hear it from a deep well within your being, one that hears the story not as an observer, but as an experiencer. So there once was a king who had this very precious cup, and he valued and cherished this cup so nearly and dearly, and it was adorned with a number of very rare gems. And one day the cup slipped from a servant's hand and it shattered all over the floor. And immediately, all those who served the king sprang to attention, and many said to the king that this servant must be punished severely. And instead, the king slowly gathered together the fragments of the cup, and he gave them to his most skilled goldsmith. And he said to the goldsmith, make something new from these pieces, put something together, and make it beautiful, something that honors what has been broken. And the goldsmith worked for many, many days. And at the end, he presented not one restored cup, but a beautiful mosaic that represented the king's entire kingdom, mountains, rivers, villages, people, all created from the shattered remnants of the cup. And the goldsmith said, Your Majesty, the cup in its original form could serve only one purpose and one person. Now, as a mosaic, it tells the story of our entire kingdom and can be witnessed by all. This story perhaps reflects to us that it is in what is breaking apart, the systems that are shattering, that they're not meant to be restored in their previous form. In other words, when we're in this threshold of in between, this liminal place, we are not just aching for what was, we are looking for the remnants and the shattered pieces to come together in a new form that will not serve only what is individual, but it will begin to shape a collective narrative that is for us all. And of course, this very concept of looking for light that is breaking through the shards comes from the poet Rumi. And of course, Leonard Cohen used these words to somehow support us to understand that when we lean into the cracks, especially when we are in in-between moments between what was and what is coming, that it serves us to seek the cracks where the light is breaking through, to give us the vision and the hope, the purpose and the trajectory to light our way forward. And so I invite you to hear these words from Leonard Cohen as words of wisdom that invite us to see that perfection is not what we are seeking in between. We are actively engaging in the cracks. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. These cracks that are in our system, our institutions, our relationships are precisely where transformation lives. It is exactly where we need to be. It serves none of us to pretend that we are somehow living into an old paradigm that is falling apart. And in the icky in-between middle, that place of discomfort where we're longing for something predictable, sure, and certain, we are in the unknown. And when we are in the known, we are entering the fractures that are illuminating what was previously hidden. It is revealing those very uncomfortable truths and opening us in to new possibility. So let's turn now to some very practical approaches that you can take, that we can take to actually navigate this landscape of distrust, of fractured distrust, not with this naive restoration of what was, but with that very clear-eyed engagement for what we are becoming together. So the first strategy is what I call conscious futuring. And it's a very distinct practice that has robust support from neuroscience that can help us engage in the possibility, the formation of possibility pathways that actually can alleviate some of our anxiety about being in that icky middle. So conscious futuring is a practice. It is a practice that helps expand our time perception, that increases our tolerance for what is uncertain. And this is founded by some very important research that establishes that individuals that have greater future time perception experience lower intolerance of uncertainty, which also reduces anxiety. So here's how you practice futuring. You may go outside, or you may stand by a window, or any way that you can essentially evoke a panoramic vision. And as you're in that comfortable position, allow your eyes to go forward, far and wide, to look out over a very broad and distant horizon. And as your visual field widens, you will notice that you are similarly expanding, that your sense perception is following your field of vision. And you can do this with your eyes closed or open. As you expand your gaze forward, far and wide, even if you have a visual impairment, you may see or visualize yourself standing at that high point, seeing not just the immediate landscape, but far off into the distant, off into the horizon. And from this perspective, actively notice a point of uncertainty in your life, something that is nebulous, unsure, unclear, something that gives that place of dis-ease on the inside, because we are hardwired for certainty. And so anything that is uncertain or unknown will likely make us feel a little bit afraid. And notice how that wider temporal perception may help change your relationship with uncertainty. And then I encourage you to actually journal or take down some notes, jot down some ideas, some ways of responding to that exercise. The second strategy that I encourage you to engage in is a wise discernment. So often we oscillate between kind of, we'll call it naive trust and then cynical distrust. And we tend to have a very all or nothing perspective, especially when it comes to trust. Cultivating wise discernment suggests that when we have that functional skepticism, that part of ourself that's questioning while remaining open, willing to engage in what could be. So it's pairing cynicism with curiosity. When we can hold both together, it creates resilience within ourselves. And so, how do we pair together cynicism and curiosity? Well, here are some questions that you may consider on your own, ways of engaging with your life and what's happening in the world. These are 3 wise discernment inquiries that you can use so that you are engaging in that place in the middle between cynicism and curiosity. First of all, when encountering any sort of information in your life, anything that causes some dis-ease, you may notice from an objective stance what evidence or what truth supports what I'm experiencing. Another way of putting it be, what do I know to be true? The second question is, what interests may be shaping my perception, including your own biases, what you may not be willing to engage in or see or perceive, what may be uncomfortable to acknowledge. But essentially, how are there influences that might be shaping your perception of this system? And then this is the key question. What wisdom does your body have to offer? What do you know, especially deep within the body, as you engage with someone or something that may be bringing forward a cynical response, and you want to lean into an opportunity of curiosity, balancing between the two? The final strategy is to develop a relational resilience. And this is necessary now more than ever. And if you do not have a community, I wholeheartedly invite you to join the Conscious Collective, a community that gathers for conversations like this one each and every month. You are welcome. There is a place for you. Institutional trust, when it is fractured, interpersonal trust can be increased and cultivated as a way of developing collective resilience. So when we intentionally build trust in small groups, it creates resilience against a broader societal uncertainty. So it's your time. It's an invitation for you to actually create or build or join some sort of trust pod, a collective or a community, a small group that meets regularly with the explicit goal to build resilient relationships. You may begin each gathering with a very simple question of what's something that you may be either cynical or cautious or careful to share right now, but it would feel supportive, mutually beneficial. There would be interconnected shared space in speaking it aloud and sharing verbally. And if verbal sharing isn't something that's natural for you, even being in that space, bringing your questions, bringing your fears, bringing your worries, bringing the conundrums that live within you, it's about showing up, sharing sacred space, and allowing the collective wisdom to hold you in a very direct and real way. And when we build these resilience systems, these micro resilient networks, it supports us to navigate the systems that are directly falling apart. So as we conclude with looking at this exploration of fractured trust in our systems that are actively disorienting and falling apart right now, I invite you to consider that perhaps we are not meant to restore what was. We are not meant to restore what was. And rather, there is an invitation to create what could be. The systems that are failing and falling apart today were often built on a few fallacies, some illusions of extraction, of scarcity, and of separation. And hear that once again. Paradigms and illusions of extraction, of separation, and of scarcity. And the fracturing may be painful, but it is also necessary. It is timely. It needs to happen right now because it is creating space for new systems, some of them that are already in existence, to be seen and heard and known and valued, perhaps for the first time. And that is key. We do not necessarily need to create something new or fresh, but sometimes it's about elevating and allowing systems that have already been in existence to be seen and known and valued, perhaps for the first time. And when we create space, we are creating space not to repeat what has been, but we are creating space that is built upon reciprocity, interconnection, and regeneration. That ability to take what has fractured and fallen apart and to see the novel newness that is a breath of fresh air and that brings forward something that is for the whole. So in our next episode, we're going to explore what we call the emergence or signals from the future to help us tolerate between what is now and what is next. And as with all of these episodes, they are looking at more of a collective movement in our world. And yet my encouragement would be that you bring it down into something that is daily and applied and real for you. Perhaps there is a difficult relationship. What would it be like to practice those 3 techniques that I already mentioned? Asking some curious questions, leaning out of cynicism into curiosity, to engage in panoramic gazing, to find a network of support, to create one that can actually support you and sustain you through a difficult time. Perhaps you are facing financial instability. Use the same techniques, because what we do on our individual behalf is also for the greater good. We do not live in isolation from one another. And so in our next episode, we will be actively exploring these hopeful examples of new systems and relationships, often that are already in existence, but are coming forward in a new way, taking root in the cracks of what was old. And so until then, I leave you with the great words of the poet Rumi. It is through the cracks where the light enters. Thank you for joining me and being part of creating that interim space between now and next.